Learning more than you ever wanted to know about Wuthering Heights and Emily Bronte. Emily Bronte is our author. Sadly, I could not get Google Slides to put those two little dots above the E in her name. Sorry about that noise. And you don't have to worry about writing it when we handwrite it either. But she does typically have two little dots over the E in her name. So Wuthering Heights, hang on. So Wuthering Heights is Emily Bronte's only novel. She was one of three sisters who wrote novels. We're going to talk about the three sisters who wrote novels. And they all lived in this house here. It was a parsonage because their father was a priest. I'll be talking about him in a second. And there is actually some lawn and some garden. You can kind of see the wall here if you can see my mouse. But mostly, when she looked out her front windows or walked out her front door, she was staring at the cemetery that was behind the church that her father worked at. So of the three sisters, Emily Bronte is clearly the darkest and the most gothic. And it's hard not to think that seeing a cemetery every day and her interest in the dead was, the result of that. Okay, so her parents were Patrick and Maria Bronte. Here on the left is a photograph of her father, Patrick Bronte was his original name. He lived into his early 90s, which is extraordinary for the time period, and that means he lived long enough that in his old age he could have a photograph taken of him. On the right is the one picture of her mother. Her mother died in her, I believe, early 30s when Emily was just tiny, I believe only 4 years old. And this is a painting that was done of her at the time that's obviously not in great condition, but she did not live long enough to have her picture taken. Her father was an extraordinary man. He was born Patrick Bronte in Ireland in poverty. He joined the army to make a better life for himself and ended up going to Cambridge University. I assume you've heard of it. It is incredibly fancy. He went there and became a priest because that's a profession you could kind of learn your way into. But it is an extraordinary 19th century story of somebody who, at a time when there was not a lot of mobility between classes, you really stayed where you were. He moved to a different country. He went to a prestigious university. He served his country, and he became a priest. And when he had sort of settled in England, Bronte seemed like a very Irish, very poor name, and so he changed it to Bronte, and he put those two little fancy dots above the E to make himself sound fancy. They had 6 children. You only have to write down the ones that are in bold. Maria, Elizabeth, Charlotte, Bramwell, that's the only boy, Emily, and Anne. Charlotte, Emily, and Anne became best-selling, famous authors. Charlotte and Emily both have books that show up in the top 10 on the AP Lit exam. If we went down to the Barnes & Noble at 7 Corners, multiple copies of each of their books would still be sitting there close to 175 years after they published them. That is an extraordinary level of success for anybody, but particularly for women writing in the 1800s, though the 1800s did see a surge in women writers. So they had 6 children, not but a few weeks after the youngest, Anne, the lesser of the 3 writers, was born. Patrick gets assigned to a small parish in a town called Haworth up in Yorkshire in the north of England. They all get in a carriage and spend days, possibly weeks, getting up there. It is remote. It is poor. The Industrial Revolution has touched the town because there is, I forget if it's a mill or a coal mine, but there is industry within the town. There is a lot of farming. There are a lot of sheep. He gets up there with his wife and 6 children. His wife has given birth in the last 2 months. She is not recovering as well as one might hope, but he gets to work, making himself at home with people who were very suspicious of him to start out with. And sadly, within a year, his wife dies of what was probably cancer, and she is buried in this graveyard that all of her children would have seen. Patrick, being an extraordinary man who's already lived an extraordinary life, continues his extraordinaryness, that's not a real word, and his interest in making sure that his daughters are educated very, very well. So he packs Maria, Elizabeth, and Charlotte off to boarding school. Also, they don't have a mom at home. He needs some help. This boarding school was so badly run, the children were abused, they were starved, and there was no hygiene practice. And so typhoid went through the school and killed a huge percentage of the girls there. Maria and Elizabeth both died. Charlotte got sick, but managed to come home before she died. Side note, Charlotte Bronte, I believe, didn't reach 5 feet. She was an incredibly tiny, short woman. And some people suspect that the malnutrition at the school is one of the reasons. But she had the trauma of seeing her mother die, be sent off with her two big sisters, seeing her two big sisters die, and being sent home. Emily lost her mother and her two older sisters before she was, I believe, 7. As you can imagine, Patrick Bronte did not want to send his children off to school after that. There was not a suitable school in the community. There were lots of other children, but most of them were working on farms or working in the industry in the town. So also Charlotte, Bramwell, Emily, and Anne didn't really have peers who were middle class and intellectual and academic in the way that they were. Patrick Bronte essentially homeschooled them with some help from some local teachers. The children grew up and read a ton. They just hung out in this house with a graveyard, got taught the Bible by their father, were allowed to read a huge number of books. He did not censor their reading. They also all created really elaborate games and worlds. They created worlds, they created characters based on what they read about in the newspapers. They were reading about the Napoleonic Wars when they were growing up. And so, I can't remember if they were reading about them in newspapers or it would have just happened in history, but they were reading about them, and they write the military heroes from this. They incorporate into their stories. They create languages within their stories. So Wuthering Heights is Emily Bronte's only novel, but we have all of these journals and things that she wrote when she was younger. In the sci-fi fantasy world now, we would call what she did like really extensive world building of like creating this universe. But very little formal education, extensive reading, and extensive playing in a garden that overshadowed a graveyard that had her mother buried in it. It had her two older sisters buried in it. Of the 4 children, you can see that there's one boy. And as you might imagine, all the family's hopes and dreams were pinned on Bramwell. Bramwell was supposed to become an artist, particularly a sculptor, though he did painting also in the Romantic style. He went off for an interview when he was about 20 at one of the art schools in England, and he got rejected, and his art career went nowhere. And he went home and proceeded to drink himself to death over the next decade, while the 3 remaining sisters ran the house, looked after their father, cleaned things, did housework, wrote, best-selling, super important cultural novels that became sensations and made them famous. What those books were Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, which was, I believe, published the same year as Wuthering Heights. It was published within 12 months of it. Charlotte Bronte is the one who lives the longest. Charlotte Bronte lives to be 36. And so Patrick Bronte lived into his 90s, and he buried in this house his wife and all 6 of his children. Technically, one of them was buried somewhere else, but metaphorically, we're going with it. Jane Eyre is her most famous book. I believe it is the 3rd book that comes up most often on the AP Lit exam, and we may be reading it in quarter 3. She writes 2 other books. Again, she lives for a little longer. Wuthering Heights is written by Emily Bronte. She also wrote poetry before this, which was not particularly successful commercially. Wuthering Heights is definitely the darkest of these. Jane Eyre does a lot of other, like, playing around with tropes. It plays with kind of fairy tale tropes, but it is not nearly as sort of bleak as Wuthering Heights. And then The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, which is still probably on the shelf down at Barnes & Noble at 7 Corners. It just doesn't show up on the AP Lit exam, and it's not quite as famous. Anne Bronte was the social activist of the group. She did some community organizing around better conditions for the workers in the town. She was very involved with that. And The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is, I believe, if I remember correctly, about the unfairness of divorce laws on women. But they were all sensations, all big deals. They were all originally published under male, or at least male-appearing names, though it was very quickly discovered that they were all written by women. This is a picture of the center of their town. You can see that it is small. You can see the fields. It's built on this steep hill. We now think of them as quaint, but they are not particularly elaborate. Very simple. Again, poverty, rural, isolated community. You can see over here it says the Black Bull. This is the pub in the center of the town. The pub or the bar is right next to the church. This is the social center of the town. There is the church where her father worked and preached. And right next to it is the pub where the men, because only men were allowed in there, could go and drink. And that is the pub that their brother Bramwell went to every day and drank himself to death within 10 years. Women were not allowed in, but they made an exception for Emily Bronte. At the end of the night, she would come in and but help her brother to make it home. Their house, this church, this is the front of the church. If you go around to the back of it, there is the graveyard, and behind that is their house. So they were just a quick 2 to 3 minute walk away from the pub and the church. Turned out to be bad news for Bramwell, but I think it says something about Emily that they say she was always the one who went and got him from the pub. Emily was apparently, and this is for your notes, extremely introverted, did not really want to socialize with people outside of her family, which was very different than Charlotte, who really did. She was also apparently very tall, striking looking. She was apparently very brave. There's a famous story where 2 dogs, they had a dog, I believe named Keeper, big English bulldog, and the dogs got into a fight. And nobody knew what to do. And she came out of the kitchen with black pepper, threw black pepper, so essentially maced the dogs because it was a very vicious fight, got between the dogs and dragged their dog back into the house. And this wasn't dogs barking each other at the dog park in Arlington. This was a vicious working dog, biting fight. And she got bit on the arm and supposedly, got the dog in the house, locked the door, walked into the kitchen, and took a hot iron and sutured her. Sutured isn't the word. What's the word I'm using? But essentially burned her wound closed. So known for being courageous and not suffering fools gladly. Again, this is the house, so if you looked out the front of the house, you're looking at the graveyard and the back of the church. If you looked out the back of the house, you would be looking at the opening to the moors. You may have heard of the moors. There's a famous murder that happened. It's a geographical feature in England. It's open land. It's in the north of England. It's not really suitable for growing crops. It's often very rocky. So the soil is just not good for cultivating anything other than grass and heather. Trees don't really grow there. This tree in this picture is an anomaly. It's very exposed to the elements. They are either seen as barren because they're useless lands that won't grow anything, or as very beautiful because they're there for this sort of land that's been left open. In the springtime, the heather blooms and turns purple. This picture is of a place called Top Withens. It would have been a ruined house, it is just these walls back in Emily Bronte's day even, but the location is supposed to have inspired Wuthering Heights. The Wuthering Heights is the name of a house that the book is named after, and it stands on the moors on a hillside looking out. So front of the house, you see a graveyard. Back of the house, you see this incredibly inspiring or scary landscape, depending on your point of view. Last point. There are 2 things that are definite about this book. The location and setting are very, very, very important. And how the story is being told to us is very important. Our setting. We are set in Yorkshire in the north of England. It is poor. The people we're going to read about have some money, but still not a lot of money compared to what other people have. It is isolated. There are not a lot of creature comforts, even in the big fancy houses. One house is called Wuthering Heights. Wuthering is essentially interpreting through the Yorkshire dialect for Weathering Heights, on the idea that it's out on this outcrop, and because it is on a hill and it has open land with no trees around it, it is somewhat prone to having fog, rain, storm sort of batter at it. It is weathered. It is Wuthering Heights. And it is out on the moors, and it is an old house. In the first chapter, we hear that it was probably built around 1500, or they see an inscription that says 1500, which would have been the early Tudor period. The other house, which I'm mostly just going to call the Grange, because it's kind of hard to say, is Thrush Cross Grange. It is nicer and more modern by 1801 standards. They're called neighbors. They're not neighbors about what we think of in Arlington. You can't see one house from the other, but it is within an hour of each other, kind of getting on your horse and going back and forth. People can walk back and forth. It's quite a walk, but they can. And those 2 houses and who lives in them and who moves into them and who owns them really tell you, as we go through the book, everything you need to know. Who is in Wuthering Heights, who is in Thrush Cross Grange, who owns what, who moves between them. So here is the picture of Top Withens. So this is kind of the atmosphere that Wuthering Heights is. This is a house whose name I've forgotten, but supposedly inspired Thrushcross Grange. It has a walled garden, which is going to be important. Again, the idea that this is much more protected by the elements. It is not out on the moors. It is in a slightly more protected place. And then the narrative structure. The story is being told to us by somebody named Mr. Lockwood. He is telling us this in first person. So like Nick told us the story of Jay Gatsby and the Great Gatsby. He tells us that he is living at, wait for it, Thrushcross Grange. In 1801, he is renting it. His landlord owns it, obviously, and his landlord is Heathcliff and lives at Wuthering Heights. He has several encounters with Heathcliff going to visit him, getting snowed in at Wuthering Heights. He meets Kathy, because she appears to him as a ghost. This happens in like chapter 2. It's not a spoiler. A ghost who can touch him, which is unpleasant. But he has several encounters with Wuthering Heights and is just perplexed by it. And back at his house, Nellie Dean, Mrs. Dean, turns out is his housekeeper. And he asks her if she knows anything about it. And she says, oh, I do. I was the housekeeper at Wuthering Heights for years. And the book is Nellie Dean telling Lockwood the story, which means we're hearing things oftentimes second or third hand. Sometimes Nellie was there, sometimes she wasn't, sometimes she heard things, sometimes people told her things later. This makes some editions of the book, your edition cleans it up, but some editions go wild with the quotation marks because it's Lockwood telling us something Nellie Dean told him about something somebody else told her. So we are very much getting secondhand information here. And it is occasionally interrupted by Lockwood becoming ill. So the story is already kind of telling us that we have several unreliable narrators and to think about the way we're getting this information. And that is quite enough for right now. It is time to open your books and get started reading.